Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives. I'm Heidi Kuda, and today Hi-Fi Jim and I are interviewing my colleague from Byline Times, Russell Jones. He's a weekly columnist, he is a cancer survivor, and he's going to talk to you about a decade of Tory governance, what he calls the end of an era, and what happened when they started taking things away from the NHS. Have a listen. Oh, this is so wonderful to have my colleague from Byline Times and Byline Supplement here, columnist Russell Jones. He has written profusely on UK politics, written multiple books about the failings of the Tories, the end of an era, a decade in Tories, all kinds of things. But he also shared an incredibly personal story, which he will share with us today, I hope, about his cancer anniversary, 15 years since he had a real horrific life-threatening event. And as he will tell you, if it had occurred just a few months later, he might not be with us today. And that is our hook. We're going to be talking about the National Health Service and the hits that it's taken in the UK. And Russell, can you kind of tell us where your Twitter fame started and took off and kind of, begin there? Because I think it's a very important part of your story.
Twitter fame isn't the same as real fame, by the way. It's a completely different thing. I'm not really famous. I just very occasionally get noticed by somebody who tells me that they don't like me. So I was a computer software engineer for 35 years, and then I've always been reasonably politically active and politically conscious. And I come from a family that was like that. When COVID started, and we had the Conservative government under Boris Johnson, it was already known before COVID even began that it was a fairly chaotic government. The man had no really clear idea about what he wanted to do. He didn't want to be prime minister. He wanted to have been prime minister at some point in his life. It didn't go into office knowing he wanted to do something. He just wanted to be something. So he didn't have a clear ethos. He didn't have a clear idea what he was doing. He was a bad manager and a chaotic individual. And everything you can see in his personal appearance is a direct reflection of the sort of individual he is. Um, and so when COVID started, we got into lockdown far too late. There were multiple warnings from lots of people around the world. There were quotes from people in the CDC saying that when they heard about Britain's approach to COVID, they thought it was a joke. The CDC in USA genuinely thought that the British, it was satire, that what they heard about British policy. So I wasn't expecting a great deal when we went into lockdown, but then over the course of the first 2 or 3 weeks, the government issued multiple policies, none of which have been thought through, many of which were contradictory, and which had the effect of producing great comedy. For example, 2 weeks into lockdown, they accidentally made it illegal to travel to Wales, which is one of the 4 countries of the United Kingdom. It suddenly became accidentally, with no planning, illegal for you to travel into Wales. You could travel out of Wales, but once you're out of Wales, you couldn't travel back. And these are countries you don't need a passport to go back to these. It's the equivalent of being illegal to travel from New York to New Jersey. And that was a complete accident. And then 3 days later, they changed their minds, and it was chaotic. But there was a lot of accidental comedy arose out of it. So I had, I don't know, 200 or 300 followers on Twitter. I was absolutely nothing and nobody. But I started documenting what these mistakes were, and within a couple of weeks, they were getting retweeted 1.5, 2.5 million times a week. And I suddenly had 350,000 followers on Twitter. So off the back of that, I got contacted by a publisher, who are a sister company of Byline, who I write for now. And they asked me if I'd be interested in writing a book about the COVID crisis and the politics behind it. And it sounded interesting, but I realized that I couldn't write very cogently about what was happening in COVID without explaining how Britain had ended up in such a parlous state, which was largely the result of 10 years of mismanagement by consecutive Conservative governments beginning in 2010. So rather than just write what would have been already a fairly challenging book about, a challenging project, to write about what was happening in the year of COVID, took it upon myself to write about 10 years of Conservative government and ended up writing a sort of 600 page, 700 page book about that, which I was very surprised was popular. But it was a bestseller here in Britain. It went into the top 10. And it was a really enjoyable experience. So off the back of that, I've written two additional books about what happened under Liz Truss and another one about what happened with the rise and fall of Rishi Sunak. So between the three of them, they cover 14 years of perhaps the most chaotic and disorganized and disastrous governance that this country has had for 200 years. We've been around a long time and we've had some pretty bad governments, but the ones that started in 2010 kind of took the biscuit.
Thank you so
Oh,
much for that. Now, what
yeah.
I would love for you to do is talk to us about the study that came out about the NHS in 2008 and then what happened after that, because that's something I know that the guys and our viewers will be keenly interested in because we can absolutely relate to it in America.
Sure. I mean, just to give you a background of how important the NHS is to the UK. The NHS was started in 1947. Before that, we had private health, and we had just as many deaths as anybody else in the world did. Poor people just could not afford medical treatment at all. Um, so the Labour government that came in 1945 at the end of World War II, one of the first things it said was it was going to have take care of its citizens from cradle to grave, and it founded the NHS. And anybody under the age of 90 has spent their entire life in the NHS. They were born there, all their treatments happened. And this is a service where you can walk into any doctor's surgery or you can walk into any hospital, get all the treatment that you require, and walk out and not pay a single penny. All of it is funded through taxation. Now, that sounds quite bad, but one of the things that you have to realize is that the cost of taxation sounds like it's a terrible thing. Two separate studies that were made by the Commonwealth Fund, which is an international independent body, and they studied health services in wealthy nations. So they studied the USA and Canada and across Europe and the UK and Japan and China and Australasia. They basically did studies in order to find out which approach to delivering a health service was the most effective and efficient. And the British National Health Service came top. They did two studies 5 years apart, and the NHS came top twice. There were 23 areas of treatment that were measured, from geriatric treatment to infant treatment to cancer treatment and heart treatment, etc. And the NHS came top in 21 of those and came second in the other two. It was also found to be the most administratively efficient health service in the world. Um, and it was also one of the cheapest. It cost less per person than any other country's health system. To give you an idea of what this was, and these figures date back to 2008, which was the last time that this was taken. But at that time, in the UK, we paid $3,129 per person in taxation. That was averaged across the population. $3,129 compared with what was paid in the USA, which is the most expensive, and that was $7,538 per person on average. You have to bear in mind that you'll be able to tell me, but there are a huge number of people in the USA who have no health insurance. So that means that the average that's paid by the people who do have health insurance is much larger than the $7,538. So you're paying twice as much in the US as as you did in the UK. And the only thing you have to pay for in the UK is what's called a prescription charge. If the doctor writes a prescription for a drug that you need, you take it to the nearby pharmacy, you hand it over, and you pay £4.80, regardless of what the drug is. It makes absolutely no difference at all what the drug is, how expensive if it is. It's a flat fee. And that's because the National Health Service, being a large body, it's the largest employer in Europe, has the capacity to buy drugs at volume at lower costs. So the costs for each drug come down for everybody. Um, Now, all of this seemed fairly abstract to me because I'd never really had much to do with the NHS. I was born in a hospital and I'd perhaps been to a GP, a family doctor. I've been to a GP maybe half a dozen times in my life for minor ailments, and I'd broken the odd finger and broke my nose and I'd had the odd injury, but I'd never really had anything serious happen to me. And then in 2010, I was working from home one day on a Monday, and I felt a little unwell. Not terrible, but a little bit bloated. And I went to the bathroom, and when I went to the bathroom, there was blood in my urine, which it was unexpected for me. It's not something that happens to men very often.
Yeah, that's
And
not a good sign.
it's never a great sign, no. So I phoned up the NHS's free telephone service. You could just call up and speak to a doctor. And I phoned up and spoke to a doctor, told him my symptoms, and he said, I'll call you back. And less than a minute later, I got a phone call back and said, we found you an appointment at a local family doctor, a GP surgery. It's less than 3 minutes drive from where you are. Go now. So I realized then it was quite important. Obviously this doctor took this seriously. So I jumped in the car and I went to the GP's, the general practitioner's surgery, and I gave a urine sample, and she took one look at it and said, "Oh my God, is that yours?" and grabbed her hair and ran round in circles in the office. And part of me was laughing at how bad her bedside manner was, but part of me was thinking, this is actually pretty serious now. So she said she would refer me to the nearby hospital, and I should go home and wait for a call for going into the hospital. So I drove the 3 or 4 minutes back home again. By the time I got home, I was in agony. Something had gone very badly wrong inside me, and I'm a rugby player, and I used to climb hills, and I'm not a shrinking violet, and I've broken my leg and I've broken ribs and all sorts of things. But this was a new level of pain, really. And I collapsed on the hallway, and when I looked down, the carpet was covered in blood, and I was covered in blood, and it was on my hands and on the wall. And I called an ambulance, and they turned up in less than 8 minutes, and they put on the blue lights and headed down through busy traffic to the local hospital. And I was filled with morphine and taken away for treatment. And what happened was that over the course of the previous couple of years, I'd been slowly growing a cancer on my kidney, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it ended up being, I'm afraid I'm going to go into UK weights and measures here, so you may have to get out your conversion charts. But it ended up being 17 centimeters across, and it was virtually circular. It was virtually a ball. So it was a solid ball of tumor, which was 17 centimeters. That's about 8 inches. And it weighed 5 kilograms, which is around about the weight of twins. Over the previous couple of years, when I've been playing rugby on a Sunday morning, I found myself getting out of breath more and more. But I thought, well, I'm getting near to 40. Maybe it's just age. But it turned out what happened was that the cancer had slowly compressed my right lung. It had grown up into my chest cavity and compressed my right lung, so I wasn't breathing properly. I had no idea it was there until the morning I was taken into hospital. And I received extraordinary treatment. I was in hospital for 7 weeks because they had to get internal bleeding under control. What had happened was the tumor had got so big it had torn open, and it had bled through into my bladder, which is why I was weeing out. And the agony was because it had congealed, the blood had congealed inside me and prevented me from weeing. So all the liquid I had inside me was backing up into my kidneys and into my bladder and my whole urinal system. And it was pretty grim. But the treatment I got was extraordinary. I was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For 7 weeks, I was in there. I had doctors and nurses taking care of me. And it's important to mention as well, because this is something that's become a major problem across the world in the time since I was in hospital. At that period, nobody really seemed to care very much about migrants in this country. Half of the doctors and nurses who treated me, at least half, were migrants. I was fairly nonchalant and stoical about what I thought was my impending doom. But a couple of nights before I went in for my surgery, I found myself unexpectedly having a little bit of a weep in my bed one night. And a Malaysian nurse, I remember she was Malaysian, I can't remember her name, and it's just gone forever. But she came and sat by me. She didn't say a word. She just brought a chair over and she sat by my bed. And she pulled the curtains around my bed and she sat and held my hand for about 2 or 3 hours. And it's one of the most moving and intimate and personal things that's ever happened to me. And of all the surgeons and oncologists and professors and doctors who cared for me. It's that personal care that you get from an individual that stuck with me the most.
Can you please tell us all the different countries that the people who helped you were from?
Oh,
Because I think it's really remarkable.
I don't think I could begin to list them, but specific examples. One of the major doctors who took care of me was Polish. My surgeon who did the surgery on me to remove my kidney and my cancer and treat me, it was 11-hour surgery. He was Greek. Um, I don't just mean like in the sense that you might say Irish American or Greek American. They were actually born in Greece and had moved to the UK. They were first generation immigrants in the UK. My anesthesiologist was Indian. My oncologist was, well, I had two oncologists. One was Greek. I had a Lebanese doctor. I had multiple nursing staff from Africa, from the Indian subcontinent, and from Pakistan and Bangladesh. I had French. Um, there was a German doctor who wanted to fly across to the UK to do the surgery and ended up not doing it. He took a look at how big the cancer was and decided he didn't want to touch it. But I mean, countless people from all over the world, and it's one of those things that I think that in the whole debate that ended up following this around Brexit in 2016, which regardless of what everybody says was just a protest against migrants. The thing that people forget about this was the migrants that we would have been able to operate in this country, we would be unable to function. I don't just mean the NHS, I mean across the entire nation. We would be unable to function if it wasn't for migrants. And people who think that you can just flick a switch and make migrants go away, they're deluded and immoral and short-sighted as well, because I'd done all the right things. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I played rugby, I'd started my own business, I worked hard. I was not the sort of person that you would imagine getting a life-threatening cancer at the age of 40, but I did. And it could happen to anybody. Half of everybody in the world will have a cancer at some point in their lives. And if you're in a developed nation, the chances are that you will be treated by somebody who's an immigrant. And if they're not an immigrant themselves, they're the child of immigrants. The idea that we can simply turn off the world, send everybody home, is delusional and racist, I think. And I think it's malign. It's as much of a cancer on society as the cancer in my torso was in myself.
Thank you.
Racism.
And I,
Go ahead.
two quick things before the guys jump in. One thing is, can you tell our audience what the bill was that you received at the end of all of this? And
Yeah.
also tell them what would have happened if this crises had occurred a few months later.
Yeah. Well, after the surgery, I went home and I had a year of physio. I mean, the surgery was really extreme. I have an incision that went more than half of the way around my body. It was literally more than half of my torso's circumference. Because the kidneys are at the back, but because of the way it was sat, they had to go in through the front and they had to make a huge hole in me. So when I woke up, I couldn't walk. I had my stomach muscles had been severed in two. I literally couldn't stand up. So I had to have physiotherapy and I had to have treatment and post-cancer treatment. And then I took the decision. I was asked if I'd be prepared to get involved in a drug trial it was entirely voluntary. I didn't have to, but it was a 3-year drug trial of a drug that could potentially prevent this sort of cancer from happening again. So I said yes because I thought it was the right thing to do. And it seems, as far as I can tell, it seems as though that drug is actually useful and is going onto the market. It's going to be available to people on the NHS in the UK and possibly in other countries as well. So I think that was probably a good thing to do. But I remember speaking to the professor who was leading the drug trial at the nearby cancer specialist hospital that we have here. And I told him what my cancer had been and what had happened to me. And he'd worked in various countries in the world. He was British, well, Scottish actually. But he'd worked in the UK, he'd worked in Canada, he'd worked in the USA, and he'd worked in Australia, and I think he'd worked in Europe as well. And he told me that if this had happened to me in the USA, my hospital treatment would have cost me at least $750,000. And the post-cancer treatment that I had, which lasted for 10 years, would have added another million to that. So you're looking at $1.75 million, which would have bankrupted me and left me homeless, and would probably have done the same to multiple members of my family as well. Here in the UK, my bill was absolutely nothing. I never received a bill. No, it wasn't just that they sent me a bill and it says you don't owe us anything. It's never even contemplated that you get a bill. It's just something that you are treated and you walk away at the end of it, and that's it. In fact, more than that, I mentioned earlier that the only thing you have to do on the NHS is pay for your prescriptions. If somebody writes a prescription for a drug, you take it to a pharmacy, you pay £4.80 to get the drug. If you've had cancer, you get free prescriptions for life, because it's assumed that you're going to have to go to the pharmacy a lot, and they don't want you to have to pay your £4.80 every time. And just in case there's people from the US who are wondering what the exchange rate is, £4.80 is about $5.10. It's the kind of money that you pay on a couple of coffees. But I've never paid a prescription charge in the 15 years since for anything. I didn't pay for my physiotherapy. I didn't pay for my cancer treatment. I had 3 years of post-cancer treatment 3 times a year, where I would go in and they'd do CT scans and X-rays and check my blood to make sure there was no recurrence of it. And then once I was out of the immediate danger zone, that went to become once every 6 months, and then once every year. And then 10 years, they wrote me off and said, "We think you are completely cured." And it didn't cost me anything at all. Now, this was useful. I was very lucky in lots of ways. I was lucky to have been born at a time where in a country with the National Health Service, and I was lucky that I was born at a time. I mean, if I'd have been born 50 years earlier, the treatments that I received wouldn't have existed. If I was born in Mozambique, I would have just died. There would have been no options. If I was born in the USA, I may well have survived, but I've been left bankrupt and homeless and owing somebody $1.75 million. So I was very fortunate in lots of ways, but one of the ways that I was most fortunate is that this happened before the Conservative Party could implement their changes to the NHS and the things that they wanted to do. One of the you have to understand that Britain is not a religious country. We don't really, I mean, I'm not saying there are no religious people here, but we're not religious in the same way that the US is. We're actually a very, very secular country. If you were to ask, other than, our observant Muslim population, our observant Jewish population, if you were to ask the average ethnic white Briton their opinions of God, some of them might go, I don't really think about it very much. But most of them would go, I'm an atheist. We don't really have a religion. But the NHS is as close as we have in this country to a belief system. Everybody here loves it. Everybody does. And we have done for years. And that's not just an opinion, that's backed up by the data. So in 2010, just before the Conservative government came into office, there was a study of approval rates for the NHS in the UK. And as is always the case, you have, everything from very strongly disapprove to not bothered to very, very strongly approve. So at that point, the highest ranking score you could give was very strongly disapprove. And the very strongly approved got 82%. 82% of people in the UK very strongly approved of the NHS. After the Conservative government spent 14 years in office, they had the lowest investment in the NHS in history. They privatised 25% of it. They split it up into independent competing bodies because they thought that you didn't get the best results out of this was based on nothing but ideology, but they had an ideological belief that competition would get better results rather than cooperation. So they split the NHS up into competing individual trusts, which were able to run their own hospitals, and they had to buy and sell services to other hospitals rather than just sending patients around the place. So all these things combined ended up, they took the approval rate down from 82% to 24% in 14 years. And we now have, at the time when I went into hospital, there was a guarantee that you could see a family doctor for a non-emergency treatment within 48 hours. You could go for an emergency treatment to any hospital and simply walk in through the door and see somebody. But family doctors were a little bit different. They operated in a slightly different model. But you got a guarantee that if you had, let's say, for instance, you had a sore throat and you thought it might be tonsillitis, and it's a relatively benign condition that can be treated with antibiotics, you could see a family doctor and get those antibiotics within 48 hours. That was in 2010. By the time the Conservatives had done their work on the NHS, they left office guaranteeing that you could see a family doctor within 18 weeks. So the entire service has been sort of dismantled and degraded very intentionally, in my opinion. I think it is an ideological objection to something that is very much in air quotes socialist. It is socialist. It's a social service, and the government, the Conservative government, just disapproves of that on principle. So they did their utmost to dismantle a system that was proven to be the most effective and efficient national health service of any kind in the world. And we've now ended up at the time when the Conservatives came in, the waiting list for hospital treatment, the number of people awaiting hospital treatment was about 600,000. That's out of a country of 67 million people. It's now more than 8 million. It's now more than one person in 8 is waiting hospital treatment in the UK. And the byproduct of this is that we also have record low productivity in the UK. And one of the reasons for that is that we've got millions, literally millions of working age people currently unable to work because they're waiting to see a doctor in the NHS. This isn't the fault of the NHS. This is the fault of systemic change that was imposed on them from above. And it's critical that this sort of thing has to be defended because it's a moral, it makes a moral, apart from the fact that it's lives that are at stake, it makes a moral statement about the sort of country that you are. It makes, in my opinion, it makes an ethical, moral statement about whether or not you are a country that values its citizens or just sees them as an asset to be exploited. And it feels to me as though Britain, for the last 14 years, made a series of wrong choices about whether or not we were prepared to be exploited. And this comes down really to the manufacture of consent through an organisation called Tufton Street. It's not just one organisation, but it's an address in London where multiple right-wing pressure groups live. There's about 11 of them who operate out of the same building in Tufton Street. And they drive the ideological movement behind the conservative ecosystem in this country in the same way that Fox News does in the UK, in the US rather. They essentially dominated the conversation. They were on every political talk show in the UK for 20 years, and the leading members of the Tufton Street Mafia, they wrote in the London Times, they wrote in the London Telegraph, and they wrote in the Daily Mail. All these are right-wing newspapers, or newspapers that have been moving increasingly to the right over the last few years. And they were mainstays. They basically wrote the editorials for them. And at the point when Liz Truss, our late lamented drive-by Prime Minister, was just about to enter office, she'd just taken over from Boris Johnson, there was a tweet that somebody wrote, a journalist wrote on Twitter, which said, "Does this mean that the Tufton Street organisation has now taken over number 10 Downing Street?" And the head of one of the organisations replied to it with one word answer, just said, "Yes." Now, for 20 years, they told us that what this country needed was a political realignment and an economic focus that's very similar to what Donald Trump is trying to do right now, and which Liz Truss did 2 years before. And they were cock a hoop when she came into office. All their dreams were about to come true. And in 49 days, she crashed the economy so completely that she made her entire party toxic for a generation, and she was thrown out of office. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, she managed to work through 4 Chancellors of the Exchequer, 4 Treasury Ministers in 49 days. Her entire party disintegrated. The economy went off a cliff. The pound was ruined. It cost us around about $480 million, which is about 6% of our GDP. And it cost us that in 49 days. it basically just wiped out the economy. And I see exactly the same thing starting to happen in the US now. So it's not all bad news in the US because we're going to get rid of Liz Truss in 49 days, and there's no election there. That was just her own party rebelling against what she'd done because they suddenly realised that she was political suicide. Over to you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that really important story. And our viewers can read about his cancer anniversary in Byline Supplement in his weekly column. It ran a week or two ago. And it's really what you bring up is so important because we have these beautiful things and these beautiful things that come with living in a free country, in a democratic country. And then you have these pernicious, malignant actors that destroy it and take it away. And look what we have in America now. And I appreciate what you said about that hope, but I'm not feeling it yet. I've got just one question, but Jim, you go ahead and ask yours and then hi-fi yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to it sound your story sounds disturbingly familiar. Uh on the other side of the pond over here. Unfortunately, some of the names are also, I think, familiar in ways that are disturbing. One name that I must bring up here is Peter Thiel, who runs Palantir.
Yes,
And Palantir recently was given a very large contract. I'm sure you know much more about it, but with the NHS,
yes,
which includes getting the private data for everyone in the United
yes,
Kingdom because it's a universal healthcare
yes,
system. Simultaneously, Palantir UK is working with the Defense Department in the UK and is
yeah,
working with NATO. One last little detail that I'll just throw in here you may not be aware of. The head of Palantir UK, out of all the people in the entire world that Peter Thiel could have chosen, he chose the grandson of Oswald Mosley,
yes,
the head of the British Union of Fascists, the most infamous and violent sort of insurgent fascist movement in British history, really. And so I find it extremely disturbing that that people with these ideologies and Peter Thiel's whole thing is about privatizing governments and getting rid of government altogether. That's his whole mindset.
yeah.
So putting somebody like that, in charge of your data, and potentially, your defense, seems extremely counterintuitive. I wanted to get your thoughts.
I completely agree. I think that there has been an assumption, a presumption that the state cannot perform as well as private organizations, that private actors work. It's predicated on the idea that if you have a look at how much money private enterprise generates compared with the money that the state generates, there's an imbalance there. Clearly, private enterprise generates more money. But the generation of money is not the only thing that state has to do. A private company can fire 1,000 workers and never have to think about them again. But a state always has to think about them. All the things that private enterprise gets rid of because it decides it doesn't need, that's slowing it down, they are the responsibility of the state. And you can't simply say, well, we don't want those people, so let's shoot them. They exist regardless. So that a state operator is always going to feel, but not necessarily be more inefficient than a private operator. But I go back again to talking about the state solution for healthcare in the UK, which costs half as much as it does in the US. And out of the countries that were measured, and they were basically all the wealthy nations in the world, Britain came top, the US came bottom in delivery of health service. You were twice as expensive as us, and you were at the bottom of the chart. And that's indicative of the fact that if you allow the private sector to operate without guardrails, it will go mad. It just will. It will go
Yes.
insane.
There,
It will
Yes.
double everything
if
around it. It will turn corrupt. It will
Yep.
turn malicious. It will stop
there's
caring
a
about people.
fundamental, in my view, there's a fundamental problem with introducing competition, exactly as you were describing before, into human health,
Yes.
right? It is the one thing that is universal.
Yep.
It is a universal need that literally everyone has, and that's why it makes perfect sense to for it to be a universal service. But because it it requires so much human effort, they see it as a way to profit, and so we get
But
these distortions.
but I found myself thinking, what would happen if we applied the same logic that we do to healthcare, or that the US does at least to healthcare, to other things which are, in the same sense, socialist endeavors? The military,
Totally.
the police, the fire
The
service.
roads.
Yeah, if the same thing happened and you run out of money, so we stop doing the work. If the police turned up and you were in the middle of being mugged at gunpoint, and they said, "Well, we couldn't do anything because we couldn't find his police card to say he was insured to be," oh, I'm sorry, your insurance doesn't cover being mugged by gunpoint. You have to get burgled. We're going to have to let you be mugged at gunpoint. It sounds nuts when you say it like that, but it's exactly the same behavior. If your building was burning down and the fire service turned up and said, "Very sorry, your building isn't insured, so we're going to leave this fire to burn. It's going to take down the whole neighborhood." Well, that's exactly the same as what the lovely Mr. Kennedy is doing now with scrapping, the
Yeah.
contagion um,
Yeah.
protection. It's
When
exactly
when
the same. Fire is contagious, so are diseases, and you can't simply say that we don't care about this stuff anymore. It's up to the individual because it's something that affects the whole of society. If you don't tackle a fire when it's in one building, you end up with Chicago burning down. And how is that good for society? And it's exactly the same with health. It strikes me as a singular failing that the politicians at least, who are making an argument for Medicare and Medicaid and the equivalents that have been Obamacare and all the things that have happened in the US, the people who are making the progressive argument for a socialist, in inverted commas, a state-sanctioned, state-supported health system, don't make that simple argument that we have socialist state functions already, and they are police and the fire service. They're the military. We don't privatize those things, and we don't say it's up to the individual to take care, make sure that you're
Well, these guys want to privatize all of those things,
well. They're
right?
insane.
That's
They're insane.
well, I mean, why the reason why
mm,
Palantir is
Yeah,
talking with
yeah.
the defense minister
yeah.
and the head of NATO is
Yeah.
because that's what they're going
And
for.
and fundamentally undemocratic. How do
I
you
agree with
unelect?
you. I
How do you
agree.
unelect Palantir? How do you
I,
vote Peter Thiel out of office? It's
that
just not
that is the
doable.
problem that we have in America, and I'm very worried for the
Yes.
UK that that's happening there.
Yeah.
So I know we have to.
That's why this interview is so important for that exact reason, Jim. It is vitally important that people stop voting for tax breaks for billionaires and, vote for their own well-being. These people that we are talking about, united from UK to America, don't want us to be well. They don't care if we are healthy. In fact, it seems to me if you're going to put a vaccine denier in charge of our health, then you really don't want us to be well. High Fidelity, get your question in before we conclude, please.
So I've been in love with the UK for a long time. You guys sucked me in with Doctor Who. Good job. So I kind of paid attention when Thatcher was around, and I kind of watched what was going on with the UK in relation to, Iraq and Afghanistan and how you guys are our friends and our buddies. We're still allies. And then something happened and I watched the UK kind of go insane, and then I saw that insanity take over here. And now when I look at the UK, I see you've got sewage in your rivers and in your swimming areas on the coasts.
Yeah.
You've got industries failing because of the insanity of Brexit. Your farmers are, food is rotting in trucks sitting at the
Yeah.
border. You've got more people dying, more people not getting health care. And yet, and yet, the one thing in the UK you're having riots about is immigrants. It makes no sense to me.
It makes
So
no sense to
my
me either.
question, here's my question. Why do the Tories hate the UK?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Um, we have a state school sector in the UK, which 93% of people go to. But the private sector, um, the terminology here is odd. In the UK, we call the private sector public schools. So it's the other way around for you. So I'll try to stick to the terminology that you use in the US. But the private sector schools, the 77% of people go to those. They tend to be quite expensive. We have places like Winchester and Eton, which are, world famous centres of excellence. Eton is £63,000 per pupil per term. So you're looking at about 120, £180,000 per child per year to go to Eton. But it basically buys you a place into the top of society. Um, Boris Johnson went to Eton. David Cameron went to Eton. I think they produced 18 prime ministers, that one small school. But the head of the BBC, the head of this organisation, all the great and the good, in inverted commas, in the UK go to this same handful of schools. So only 7% of people go to get private education anywhere in the UK at all. But 47% of our senior journalists did. They're massively overrepresented in journalism. So the story that we are told a lot of the time is a story that comes from people. I'm not saying it's necessarily a malign reason for this, but the only world that they know is the world that they grew up in. And the story that they tell us is a world that makes sense to them and their friends. They all go to the same dinner parties. They all go to the same clubs. They're all part of the same organizations and rub shoulders with the same people. And they tell a story, whether they intend to or not, that doesn't make sense to most of the country. That's one point. The second point is this, that we don't have very much political gerrymandering of borders and the areas of the voting areas in the UK in the same way that you do in lots of parts of the US. We have some, but not very much. But what we have instead is the protection of certain regions which tend to vote for certain parties. Traditionally, what happened was that much of the north of England and Scotland would vote for the Labour Party because those are the manufacturing areas and they were the workers. They tended to be a little bit poorer. They tended to be working class. They tended to vote for the left wing, the progressive parties. London and the southeast of England, where most of the money is, where most of the banking is, where most of the media elite are, they tended to vote for the Conservatives, and it was a very clear class delineation until the Thatcher Revolution in 1979, when she was voted. What most governments did was attempt to rebalance economic spending. So they would raise taxes in the south and they would spend the taxes in the north to make sure the country was more or less balanced. But that was just cancelled, first of all, by Margaret Thatcher. It was partially restored by Tony Blair when he was in office. But then when David Cameron came in, he had this policy of austerity, which meant essentially cuts to all state services. He didn't respond to the 2007-8 banking crisis as Obama did, by investing and spending money and rebooting the economy. He basically starved the economy of funds. And what this meant was that people who were making lots of money could carry on making money, but the people who relied on taxation for their infrastructure and for their schools and for their roads, all those things started to fall apart. We now have 31% of state schools in the UK. The buildings themselves are unsafe. 94% of teachers in state schools spend their own money on the pupils who go there because pupils come to school hungry or lacking food or shoes. 94% of teachers are spending their money. And bear in mind that teachers' wages in the UK were frozen for 13 years. They didn't have a pay rise for 13 years. So this is a group of people who are poor. And the end result of this is that you've ended up with a group of a large portion of the country, which is a long way away from the wealthy area in and around London, who see the representation of Britain that's presented by that wealthy elite in London on our media and don't recognise it. What they recognise is a country that's falling apart. At the same time, what happens is when immigrants come in, they can't afford that. First generation immigrants tend to have less money. They can't afford the housing in the rich areas in the south, so they move into the north. And it's easy, therefore, to tell a story that the reason you're poor in the north is because of these immigrants. It's become a simple story to tell. The truth of the matter is, it's more complicated. You're poor in the north because the people in the south have started taking all the money. Here's a little factoid for you. I hope I get this right. I hope I do. So the poorest 10% of the richest 10% of Britons, their wealth since 2010 has increased 537 times more than the poorest 10% of Britons. 500 times more wealth, the poorest 10. The richest 127 people in the country, that's all the billionaires that we have in the UK, 127 of them, their wealth has increased 1,000%. But for the rest of the country, the poorest 90%, average wages have fallen more than £1,500 per year since 2010. At the same time, GDP growth has increased every year. Our GDP appears to be growing. We've grown 1.2%, we've grown 2.2%, we've grown 3%. Where's that money going? Well, 2/3 of all the money worldwide that's been generated, all the new money that's been generated worldwide since 2010 has gone to the richest 1% of people. And the third that's left over has to be shared between the rest of
Yeah,
the other 99. And that's what's happened. What's happened is that um, prices have shot up.
right.
Cost of living is terrible. At the same time, there are immigrants moving into your area because you live in
Yeah.
a poorer area and they can afford the housing there. Um, and therefore, it just makes an opening for people like Nigel Farage and his Brexit party, who is, the inheritor of Oswald Mosley's title, really. The far-right party leading a insurgent group in the UK.
Wow.
Just tell this simple story that it's immigrants that are the problem. And it's just frankly not true. What's true is that we simply stopped redistributing money in the way we have done for 100 years. We just stopped doing it. And we let the
Well,
rich people take everything.
thank you. It's so painful to hear this because it's exactly parallel to what we're dealing with in America. And United Kingdom, if you're listening, don't be like us. You did a good thing by rebuking these guys after 14 years and
Yeah.
voting in, Labor to lead. Now, hopefully, Starmer and his team will actually do the things that reverse these trends. Russ, thank you so much for being with us here today.
You're very welcome.
Promise you'll come back and talk to us because Brexit and Trump are, two sides of the same coin. We have not
Absolutely.
seen the end of these people, and I just think it's really important when we bridge these gaps. And America, if you're listening, you get what you vote for. They voted these guys who took away their, benefits, their NHS benefits, and I think there's a huge lesson to be learned from this. And we just want to thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.